let's take a very brief look at the history. The history of Bani Israel, it breaks into a couple parts. The first part is in Canaan. No Jerusalem yet, what they call Canaan. Canaan was already a beautiful land. It's on the east side of the Mediterranean. And that land is divided into three types. The first part, right off the water, is where all the olive groves are. The second part is mountainous. The third part is desert. Right? So it breaks up into three. Generally, the topography is like that. And they live there as immigrants. From where? From Iraq, the city of Ur, also known as Nineveh, is where Prophet Ibrahim was born. Sayyidah Sarah is from Damascus. Damascus is the oldest city in the world, and it's where Sham, the son of Nuh, established his city. So from Iraq to Damascus, then where Prophet Ibrahim married Sayyidah Sarah, and they went to Egypt. Then they went over to Canaan, and they settled there. Okay, and they lived there. And the city that they lived in is buried is now called Khalil. Okay, it's now called Khalil. It says here El Khalil, but we just call it Khalil. So that's where it said that the first phase of the Bani Israel's existence is when Prophet Ibrahim settles here and they have their first child. And that's Ishaq. And I'm going to tell you the story about Ishaq in the next episode. But for the sake of knowing where they lived a little south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not a thing yet. And Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub, and then the childhood of Yusuf all happens there. And then later on, about 40 years after Prophet Yusuf is taken away, they all leave, and that brings an end to that period of time. So it's about, you could say, 125 years. So the end of Prophet Ibrahim's life, all of Prophet Ishaq's life, and almost all of Prophet Yaqub's life, and a little bit of Prophet Yusuf's life. So that's the first phase. The second phase is in Egypt, where they live for about 400 years. And it starts off as their welcome guests, honored guests, because the pagan pharaohs aren't ruling at the time of Yusuf. They're the Hyksos kings, and they're relatives. They're relatives of the Ishaq, distant relatives of Ishaq. But they had lost their way, but they still had an idea that there's a God, there are angels, there's a nefs. And you'll see that Zuleika and these others, they actually refer to angels and they refer to the nefs. So the basic structure of Tawheed and monotheistic religions, they have that in Egypt. And the Hyksos are the people who welcome Yaqub and all of the family of Yusuf alayhi salam. At some point, about 200-300, they lived 200-300 years in peace in Egypt. The pharaohs come back. They kick the Hyksos out. Now the Bani Israel are a lot. They're a unique group. They stick together. They're successful. Some people say Prophet Ayub is the fourth grandson of Yusuf alayhi salam, and he lives amongst them, and he has his whole story there. The Turks say something else. The Turks say, no, he's from Anatolia. I always tell the Turks, like, well, why would that make you happy? You are also from the East. You're Turkic people. The Turkic people hadn't come into Anatolia for a long time, right? So it's not like there's any connection there except the location. But the majority saying is that Ayub is actually a great-great-grandson of Yusuf alayhi salam, and he lives in Egypt, and the whole story of Ayub actually happens in Egypt. When they're a minority there, but they're living very well, and they're accepted, and they're appreciated. But then the pharaohs take over. They come back from the south. And they're not into this monotheism, and they got their own pagan religion, okay, which we're gonna talk about. And then they end up enslaving the Bani Israel. And I'm gonna tell you how that actually benefited the religion of the Bani Israel. Of course, nobody wants to be a slave worldly wise, but in terms of their religion, they benefited from it. Identity and nearness to Allah, they actually benefited from it. So that lasts about 400 years. Then Prophet Musa alayhi salam takes them out of Egypt, and for 40 years they have no land. And they go through from Sinai, this little tiny corner between Egypt and Shem is Sinai. And they actually go out the northeastern tip of Sinai and live in the northwest of the Arabian desert, which is familiar land to Musa alayhi salam, which was where he went to be with when he was exiled, or when he was chased out of Egypt. He ends up living in Arabia, actually. And so they end up living and wandering around those deserts. There's so many people. There are about 1 million people. 1 million people are not going to wander well in Sinai. It's too small. So they're going to wandering around in northwestern Arabia. And then after the death of Musa alayhi salam, then the next phase of the Hebrew history, the next big phase begins. So now we're on phase 3. Canaan, Egypt, 125 years. Then Egypt, 400 years, 40-year transition period. And now we're going to begin the big phase of the history of Bani Israel. And that phase is broken up into 3 parts too. The phase where they are living as an independent nation, independent people. They're not living under anyone else's roof and anyone else's land. And it divides into 3 phases. The first phase is about 300 years or 400 years. And that's the phase where they go into Canaan. They clear the land of all the pagan tribes in the era of Joshua and Caleb. Yusha bin Nun, he's Musa's disciple, and the youth that is mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf that is with him. And they clear out all the pagans, but they don't have a king. They live almost the way the Native Americans lived here. Each tribe has some land, cut up some land for them, and they live in the land, and their elders rule amongst them. They rule them and lead them. Okay? The elders, and this is called the era of judges, where there's no king. They're just living with their elders as tribes, sort of like the way the Native Americans lived. Like there's a fuzzy line between the Cherokee and like the Iroquois or something like that, right? So they're the 12 tribes and they live amongst them like that. Then this breaks down. And when they commit sins, now then another group of people come in, and these are the people of Jalut. And these people are miserable. And they just decimate the Bani Israel until the Bani Israel are begging for a king to create an army and fight back. And then they do get a king. So that marks us at 1000 BC. So 1,000 years have passed from Ibrahim all the way to the first king of Bani Israel, Talut, is 1,000 years. Okay, so in this period of time, they get the let's say 3B. 3A is judges. 3B is now a united kingdom, and the united kingdom only lasts for 3 kings, about 100 years. Talut, I think about 20 years. Dawood, 40 years. Suleiman, 40 years. 80 years. Total, between Dawood and Suleiman, add 20, that's 100 years. So it's really only 2 generations almost. 1 to 2 generations. They have one united kingdom. But this is the high point of their existence. At this point, they dominate Persians. They dominate Egypt. They dominate everybody. This is the only time that it happens. Okay? Allah tells us in the Quran that you're going to rise twice in your entire history. We're now going on, in terms of if you want to just follow Jewish history, forget the believing part and disbelieving part, it's 4,025 years, right? You had one kingdom for 80 years you dominated. Okay? And then again, now I could say, we could all say that they're dominating too. They're very high now. So 2 championships in 4,000 years, right? That's not such a great record, right? But Allah tells us very clearly, and we see it happening. It's almost like one of the proofs, right? You will have 2 times that you will be great. The first time is David and Solomon. The second time is now. Okay. And so, and Allah describes them as times of fasad. So the first time is good, David and Solomon, but then what happened at the end of the time of Suleiman? At the end of the time of Suleiman is not good at all. The people have become rotten. Even Suleiman is king, but he can't control all the people. So that leads us to 3C now, which is the divided kingdom, where they have a civil war. Right after Sayyidina Suleiman's time, they have a civil war. And this civil war ends up with 2 tribes in the south, and that area is called Judah, and the Romans call it Judea, but it's Judah, right? Doesn't make a difference. And then the northern kingdom is 10 tribes, but Jerusalem is in the south. So the south, the 2 kingdoms in the south, the 2 tribes in the south, Judah is the dominant one, and Israel is considered the northern 10 tribes. They call that Israel. So, and they're the inferior ones because the capital center and the great lineages are all in Judah. And we're going to tell you about which of the sons of Yaqub become the leaders, right? Which ones are the best lineages. All right, so that ends in it differently. So the Assyrians, the northern tribes, are conquered first, and then by the Assyrians. And then the Babylonians conquer the southern tribe. And they both conquer in a different way, which again we're going to get to. And the way they conquer in a different way, it actually leads to a long-standing religious feud that's going to happen. That actually reminds us, it's going to remind Muslims a lot of some of our sectarian feuds. So that brings an end to the period of kingdom. And once they're taken up to Babylon, they never are independent again. Truly independent, they're never truly independent again. They're just like, they become, if they're independent, they're like a vassal state, a small insignificant state, but they're always colonized. So the next transition period is that they spent 70 years in Babylon, in exile. Then they come back. When they come back now, they come back as a colony of the Persians. And then then the Greeks knock out the Persians, and they're a colony of the Greeks, who really were not smart colonizers. They were not good at all at colonizing, and they actually produced a problem, right? Then the Greeks were so bad at colonizing that they end up creating a revolt, like Mujahideen come out, kick the Greeks out. And then for 100 years, they have a state, but they're sort of like too small of a state. They're not real players in the world today. Like, let's say, for example, Afghanistan, they're free, right? But no one would say they're free and they're Muslims and everything and they're running the government there. But nobody would say that this is a player in the world, right? They're not up there influencing the rest of the world. So for a short period of time, they have that. But then they get colonized again by the Romans. And then the Roman history begins. And then ultimately Prophet Isa comes after 100 years of Roman rule. Prophet Isa comes. And of course, before him, Zechariah, Maryam, Yahya, Isa bin Maryam, they all come in one generation. And that's the final generation of the Bani Israel as a believing ummah. As a believing ummah. For us, the story's over here. Because once they made kufr, the covenant's broken. At that point, we could care less what the history is. Because what we care about is them as believers. That's what ties us to them. So the believers now become the Christians. And then very quickly, there's confusion about their doctrine. And possibly intentional confusion by the Romans to bring them in. Some people think that the Council of Nicaea was just a bunch of, they screwed it up. No, it's probably more likely an intentional absorption of this Christian energy and then just like merge it with the current existing order and make sure we control it. That's more likely the case of the Council of Nicaea. But in any event, that's the end of their secular history too, just from the worldly side, because in 70 AD, 70 years after Prophet Isa bin Maryam, then the Jerusalem's completely destroyed. And who was the Roman emperor at that time? Hadrian. I think it was Hadrian who comes and he just has enough, right? Hadrian, he gets another rebellion from them and he just has enough. So now the temple's destroyed, but then Hadrian comes, I think after that, and he just has enough. And he literally, that's the Roman Holocaust. Like they holocausted them completely. And they sent them everywhere. There's no more people, no more Yahud living in that area anymore. So That happened around 100 of the Common Era. So from that time, they've been living scattered throughout the lands all the way until 1948, right, when England bought them back. All right, but that we're not going to cover that period of history. All right.